I can't believe that the first quarter of 2025 has already gone by, and it's the beginning of April. Hello, welcome to my channel, another Bibliophile Reads. My name is Greg, and I have gone the entire month of March without doing a wrap-up report, a reading report of the books that I have read. There were a number of issues that got in the way, but now I have 11 books to discuss that I read in March. I am going to be a little quick with the discussions and the wrap-up, so don't expect any in-depth details for what I read. And I will separate them out into digital books, print books, and audio books. I will start with my digital books. For March of the Mammoths, I read It by Stephen King. It was 1,186 pages long. I did originally read this book when it was published in the 80s, and I have always wanted to reread it for a number of years to see if it held up to what my younger self thought of the book. I thought it was very impressive when I read it in my 20s. Now that I'm in my 60s, I'm seeing a little more flaws. And of course, there is that famous scene at the end of the book. I won't spoil it, but it disturbs and upsets a lot of people with the direction that Stephen King wanted to go there. I did not find it so heinously upsetting as many other people. It is, in essence, a ritual for children to pass into adulthood way before they're ready to, or not, or say not ready to, should have to do. And it upsets a lot of readers. Maybe I will do a separate video talking about that, but it was just water off a duck's back for me because I knew what Stephen King was trying to do. I'm not saying he was enormously successful, but he was trying for something. Honestly, I was more upset with the disappearing ink at the end of the story because ink can't disappear. You will have to read the book to understand exactly what I am talking about. The next digital book that I finished was Heretic, Jesus Christ and Other Sons of God by Catherine Nixey. It is a historical book about the other gospels in the Bible, because the Bible has 4 gospels, but there were many other gospels around when the Bible was being put together. And some of those gospels portray Jesus in a very different light than what you get in the traditional 4 gospels. And from there, Nixey goes on to discuss the nature of heresy and gives a lot of other heretical, historical information. I thought the first part of the book was really fascinating and gripping, reading about these other gospels. Then she got into her area of history, which is basically that the church has been deceiving people for a very long time. I happen to agree with her, but she published an entire book, I believe called The Darkening Age or something along those lines. And the last half of this book just felt like it was filler, restating this book that she'd already published. Now, I have not read her other book. It just felt, reading this book, that she wasn't all there in the writing of it. The other digital book that I finished was The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This was a group read with the former Ulysses 6. We had renamed ourselves the Brothers and Sisters K for this reading project. I did read The Brothers Karamazov in the 80s in a different translation. I can't remember which translation I read back then, but I read the most current Michael Katz translation. Now, The Brothers Karamazov is a mega mammoth novel. It is 928 pages long, but it's deeper than that. It's a very complex novel of brothers, wildly different. The passionate Dmitri, the intellectual Ivan, the spiritual Alyosha. And of course, you know very early on that there's going to be a murder of their father. And who murders the father? It takes about 500 pages, or was it 600 pages, to get to the murder, but that's not the point of Dostoevsky. He is exploring the Russian nature, the Russian soul. And when you get to the end of this book, there is a lot of what Dostoevsky is saying about what he thinks is the Russian character. Completely fascinating. I read this over 2 months, and I think that was actually the wrong way to read this book. I think you just have to pick it up, and dive in and just read it over a month. You don't have to read it too quickly because there are parts you do need to digest, especially around chapter 5, or is that book 5, when Ivan is talking about his theories on religion. I found that completely fascinating. Other members of the group found it extraordinarily disturbing. But in any case, I think The Brothers Karamazov is a book that everyone should attempt to read at least once in their life. Moving on to print books. We have The Seven Madmen by Roberto Arlt. This is translated from the Spanish. It was originally published in 1929. He is an Argentinian author. The story is probably more or less set in Argentina, although he never specifies in the story which major Latin American city the story is taking place in. And it's a story of a dunner, a debt collector. And he's been skimming off the top because he's broke. And he got caught out. And the management of the company said, "Are you a swindler?" He goes, "Oh, no, I'm not a swindler. I can pay you back tomorrow morning." And then he has to find a way to gather up that money, about 600 pesos, which is a bit of money back then. It described his monthly salary as being about 500 pesos on a good month. So a lot of money for a man to come up with in one day. And yes, of course, he is a swindler. And he goes to a man named the astrologer to loan him the money. But more than getting a loan for money, which does not come from the astrologer, it comes from a pimp. And then our narrator comes up with this idea, and he pitches it to the astrologer. Why not create a series of brothels to make a lot of money and form a new religion around these brothels, and then we can really rake in the cash. So therefore, you have this sort of a comment on religion. And of course, none of these people truly believe in this religion of the brothels to come, but fascinating. And this is apparently the first half of a novel. I went ahead and I bought the second half, but I have not read it. The second half is called The Flamethrowers. It is by a different translator. I will leave both the links to these editions in my description. So I have to get to The Flamethrowers eventually. And I think this is my favorite book of the month. The second print book I read was A Little Life by Claudia Pinerio. Again, translated from the Spanish, and she is an Argentinian author again. This is the story of a woman who has a major incident in her life after she's given birth to a child. The child is about 4 or 5 years old, if I'm not completely fussing up my memory. But she abandons her child. You know sort of what's going on in the beginning. There is a great technique that she uses, where on one page you get the description of a woman pulling up to a train stop. The bars have lowered and the lights are on. But it's known that these bars are frequently mistaken. And people look both ways and then just cross the railroad passing, avoiding these bars that are down. You don't know what happens in the first time you see it. But the second time, you get a little more detail. And the third time, even more detail. And it goes on like 5 or 6 times before you really get to the incident at these railroad crossings. And it is a devastating story. And part of the story is many years later when she is an adult. It's about 20 years later, if I'm not completely mistaken. And she's going back to Argentina. And she is going to try to get back in touch with her son. Claudia Pinerio is an extremely intelligent and talented author. This is the second book I read by her. The first was Elena Knows, and I group read this with a bunch of people on Voxer. That included Pat at Book Chat with Pat, Angelia at Read and Rereads, and Brian at Bookish, and a number of other people. It was a fascinating discussion to get around, to be able to listen to these people talk so intelligently about this book. And I need to read more Claudia Pinerio. Another print book that I read that I cannot hold up because it was a library copy and it has been returned is The Unworthy by Agustina Bazterrica. She is a Argentinian author, and the book is, of course, translated from the Spanish. That's 3 books by Argentinian authors in March. Just a coincidence. Bazterrica often gets categorized as being a horror author, and I understand why, but I don't think it's traditional horror in the realm of Stephen King or Peter Straub or Edward Lee. She is more of a dystopian future kind of author, but her futures are just so grim. The Tender is the Flesh was her first novel translated into Spanish, was a novel about institutionalized cannibalism. Yeah, people raising people to eat them. But in The Unworthy, it is set sometime in the future where there has been an ecological disaster of some sort. Lots of the world is no longer inhabitable, and people are roaming around trying to survive. And this is the story of a youngish woman. It is told in a diary format, and she has joined let's just say, a nunnery. Not quite exactly the correct terminology, but it will give you the idea. Because life outside the nunnery is rather harsh and difficult. Unfortunately, life in this nunnery is also harsh and difficult. They have elevated positions for some of their members. And when you get elevated in this religious order, sometimes you have to have your tongue amputated or your eyelids sewn shut, so you do not speak of things you should not speak of, so you cannot see things you're not supposed to see. And let's just say being elevated in this nunnery is not something most young women want to find out or do. And while reading this book, it does feel very much like a diary. And this woman describes these horrors in a very matter-of-fact way. And she talks a little bit about her life before the nunnery, and she talks about this enchantress that helped her. And once you get to the story of the enchantress, I truly felt for this woman. You will have to read the book for yourself and know why I would have a soft spot for this woman's enchantress as well. Well, again, I don't think I can call this traditional horror. I think readers of horror books will enjoy this a lot. So pick it up if you like to read horror. Another book that I read was Near to the Wild Heart by Clarice Lispector, originally published in the 40s and translated from the Portuguese. This was her first book. She wrote it when she was about 23 years old. And you can just it shows just the scope and depth of this woman's mind. And this is the third or fourth book by this author that I have read. She is always fascinating. Her books are not plot related. This is all about the inner workings of the mind and the human soul and how it grows and how it learns. This one, however, is my least favorite of the 3 or 4 other books that I have read. I do prefer The Passion According to G.H. Then there's one called Aqua Vita. And there is a third one that I am not remembering right now because, of course, I did not take any notes before sitting down and filming this video. I would suggest reading other Clarice Lispector books. I'm glad that I read this just for perspective, and I will eventually pick up the 2 or maybe 3 other books that I have not read by her. I've read a bunch that are available in English, and I have her collection of short stories, which I need to read as well. Now on to the audiobooks. The first audiobook that I finished was Natchez Burning by Greg Iles, and it is in print edition, about 816 pages long, so it is also counting for my March of the Mammoths. Technically, this is the fourth book in the Pen Cage series. You do not have to read all the previous 3 books. I did read the first book in the series that introduced me to the character, so I guess that is a little helpful. Other people that I've talked to just jumped into Natchez Burning without a problem. Well, in any case, this is set in the early or mid-aughts down in Mississippi. Pen Cage is the mayor of the small Mississippi town. And there is a lot of history in this part of Mississippi, and none of it is really rather good. The Klan had a very heavy influence in the 60s, and they committed some notorious crimes. These Klansmen are now in their 70s, but they don't want their crimes coming to the surface. And it just so happened that Pen Cage's father, who is the small town doctor, had a visitor from one of his former black nurses back in the 60s. She came to die of cancer. He may or may not have helped her commit assisted suicide. Assisted suicide at that time was a crime in Mississippi, and the prosecuting attorney for a small town in Mississippi wants to convict Pen Cage's father of murder. And this gets Pen Cage riled up to investigate what's happening. And of course, he's uncovering more crimes that were committed by the KKK in the 60s, and the KKK is fighting back. Now, I said the KKK. If you've read this book, I'm not telling the entire truth there, but for the most part, calling them the KKK is fine for this brief, undetailed review. I really enjoyed listening to this audiobook. It is gripping and it is long, and it is also only the first book in a trilogy. There is a conclusion at the end of this book, but the entire story is not told. There is more out there for Pen Cage to investigate, and that is with The Bone Tree and then Mississippi Blood. I will be continuing with this trilogy probably in May, and the second book, as I said, is The Bone Tree. I'm really looking forward to it. Another book that I listened to on audio was Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I did want to read the print version of this, but I had ordered it from the library, and the library book was not ready when I needed to start reading this, because I was reading it for the I'm with the Band book club run by MJ at Reading This Life. And it is a club where we are reading a band book every month. Now, I will come right up and say this. I really liked this book. I think it stands up with We by Evgeny Zamyatin and George Orwell's 1984. It's a good book. A lot of people in the I'm with the Band book club did not get along with this story. There's not a whole lot of character development. The characters are there to move along the agenda that Huxley has in mind about this brave new world. It is a true dystopia where humans are manipulated. You no longer give birth anymore. That's for the lower animals. And of course, Huxley has to show a human being that was born on a reservation and is this savage. And he does call him a savage, even though he's of British stock and raised on an Indian reservation, probably somewhere in the United States. So you get to see a lot of this new world through savage eyes. And this new world is all filled with consumption. The main thing a person is supposed to do in life is to consume goods and to have a lot of sex and do a lot of drugs. Now, is this a true utopia that Huxley was trying to design? No. He is describing a dystopia. But for whatever reason, it hits harder to a lot of readers than We or 1984. I'm not sure why. I found it utterly fascinating. I will be returning this to the library, but I did buy an ebook version to go along with my audiobook because I will want to read this again. Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. This is the story of a 70-year-old janitor working in an aquarium, and she befriends an octopus named Marcellus. And there are a number of chapters narrated from Marcellus's point of view. A lot of readers seem put off by just the idea of this book. I don't want to read about a 70-year-old woman taking care of an octopus. But I read this for my in-person book group, and almost everyone said, Marcellus won me over. He is a very charming octopus. Of course, way smarter than an octopus would be in real life, but still a charmer. And along with the janitor and the octopus is the story of a 30-year-old man who just can't find his footing in life and ends up working as a substitute janitor in this aquarium. And everything will turn out okay in this book. I did not like it as much as the other members of my book group. Now, I am the only man in the book group, and I hate to say this in a condescending manner, but this book is women's fiction, and its intended readership is women. It's okay. I enjoyed it, but it will never be a top book in my mind. And if this author published another book, I probably would not pick it up unless it was for something like the BookTube prize or the book group. It's just something I can pass on. As I said in a previous video, this book is warm and fuzzy, and I just don't do warm and fuzzy. The last book that I finished was The Magic Labyrinth by Philip Jose Farmer. This is the fourth book in the Riverworld series. So You cannot pick up the Magic Labyrinth on its own. You have to read the other 3 books. That is To Your Scattered Bodies Go, which is the best of the series. You then have The Fabulous Riverboat, The Dark Design, and then The Magic Labyrinth. Now, I've learned since listening to these audiobooks that Philip Jose Farmer originally intended The Dark Design and The Magic Labyrinth to be one long novel, and the publisher ixnayed that idea and said, we're going to publish it in 2 volumes. I happen to think that the publisher also asked Farmer to do some editing and cutting because there's a lot of unresolved story threads, a lot of abrupt endings. When this book ended, I go, what? Oh, isn't there more wrap up? Isn't there more details you can give me? It was that kind of book. However, I truly enjoyed it. It has some of the best battle scenes in a science fiction novel that I have read in a very long time. Now, this book was written in the 80s, but still, the battle scenes between biplanes and riverboats was completely captivating and truly well done. If you want to read these books, please start with To Your Scattered Bodies Go. The main character in that first book is Richard Burton, the Victorian explorer who more or less discovered the source of the Nile, although he had to help a man named Speke. Start there. Great book. And those are the books that I read in March. It comes to a total of 5,244 pages. Even though I'm no longer on my Read What You Own challenge, I'm still counting pages. And that is my reading report for March 2025. Thank you for watching, and keep on reading.